more stable. Okay, thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my research. Today I will show some results about length scale in granular materials. So we'll talk about imbricated scales, and because granular materials are composed of very simple particles, but the overall mechanical response is involving some mesoscale that I will try to show you. So this is part of my research work carried out at the IRSTEA lab in Grenoble in France, and with Stéphane Bonelli from IRSTEA Aix-en-Provence and François Nicot from IRSTEA Grenoble. So the basic, the context of this research lies in the fact that at the engineering scale, soil has to be considered as a homogeneous material in order to model hydraulic structure, for instance, as shown on this picture, for design purpose. But at the micro scale, the soil is composed of an assembly of grains interacting between each other with different contact laws, and they can be arranged in different geometrical configuration, and the grains may have different geometry. And this basic three ingredients gives the granular media is its microscopic constitutive mechanical behavior. So on this bottom image, this is typical results you can obtain with triaxial compression, drain triaxial compression test with the same grains distribution sizes and the same contact law. The only thing that acting is the geometrical configuration that presents very different types of mechanical behavior. So the objective of my presentation today is to question the fact, to investigate if there's to propose micromechanical tools that is able to account for the macroscopic behavior and to provide a quantitative representative elementary volume definition in order to perform some numerical homogenization after, or also to define a mesoscale which contains the physics of the granular materials, and that can be used, for instance, to develop micromechanical models. So these are basically these three questions I will try to answer today. So the outline of my presentation will be composed of three parts, and the last one, depending on the time, I will show some results or we can discuss later. So first, the numerical modeling and the testing procedure I use to illustrate my talk. The definition of the force chain concept, and present how it is a convenient tool to explain the macroscopic mechanical strengths of granular material. Then I will present some tools in order to define a mesoscale associated with this mesostructure based on the two-point autocorrelation functions. And if I have time, I will show some results about the interplay between what we can define as chain particles and non-chain particles, and the way they can, these two phases can interact and give some properties as the plastic strain, definition of a plastic strain in granular media. So the sample I will use throughout this presentation is a very simple model for granular materials. So I use spherical particles with simple elastofrictional contact laws as illustrated on the bottom. So you have two stiffness, normal and shear stiffness, elastic stiffness between two grains, and and a more Coulomb type friction limit. So I use cubic assemblies of 10,000 particles, and the sample is prepared under a technique that is called internal compaction up to 20 kPa. Then you reduce artificially the friction angle to allow grains to rearrange to prepare a sample that is quite dense with here a void ratio of 0.6. So then you take this sample, you prescribe a confining pressure of 100 kPa, and then you perform a drain triaxial test under a strain velocity of 10 to the minus 2 second minus 1. So you obtain the deviatoric stress with respect to the actual strain curve represented here, which is typical of dense soil with a peak stress and then a softening regime. And this is the volumetric curve with first contractive and dilative behavior. So this is just for the sake of giving some data to show what's the ability of the force chains concept can give. So I save some, the vertical lines are the different steps. I save samples to perform some post-processing analysis. So the underlying idea to introduce the force chain concept is that actually in granular, the strength of granular media is resulting from only a very small amount of particles that are actually transmitting stress inside the granular media. So this picture taken from Zhang et al. With photoelastic grains shows how contact force are transmitted within the granular media, and you see that you have chain-like patterns inside, and which involve roughly 20% of the existing grain. So there is the existence of a primary fabric, which topology is responsible for the mechanical behavior, and this fabric is different from the fabric you can define with all the grains. So you have this kind of picture that you can also define with contact forces, and you can divide what is often done classical as strong force network and a weak force network. But what I would like to present you today is an enriched definition of a force chain that was initially proposed by Peters and al. In 2005, which is based on these three criteria. And it is a definition that is centered upon the particles and not upon the contacts. Particles belonging to a force chain should be highly stressed, and this definition of highly stressed is based on the average mean stress that you have inside a grain. So in terms of, if you consider a grain as a continuum media, you can define a stress, and you can compute the average stress from the contact forces upon the boundary. And with this mean stress, you can define the principal direction of compression that is illustrated on this figure by the arrow. So chain particles should have a principal stress higher than the average principal stress in the granular medium. In order to define column-like structure as evidentiated in this upper picture, the particles belonging to a same force chains should be aligned, and so this criteria is considered by having the direction of compression aligned with the direction of principal stress, with a threshold angle of 45 degrees here taken. And you have in order to have a structure, then you have to have more than 3 particles involved in a force chain. So these definitions can be used to identify distinguish between chain particles and non-chain particles inside the granular media, and you can restrict the visualization of the sample to only these particles. So these are the force chains. So grains of the same color belongs to the same force chain. And you have the four typical visualization along the drain triaxial test. So at the beginning you are under an isoconfining pressure, so you have force chains oriented in average space direction. And as soon as you start to apply the deviatoric loading, force chains tend to align in the vertical direction and starts to grow with the increasing deviatoric stress. At some point the length of the force chains will stabilize, and you reach this plateau and this softening regime. So this is only for so far some qualitative information, and which that's what I told you at the beginning. They are oriented randomly, and then they tends to align in the direction of compression, which is the anisotropy of the external load. And also on the figure, as I told you, there is only very few particles involved. If you look also, if you do some statistics, this is the density probability that particles of a given radius belongs to a force chain. So in the dashed line is the probability density for the whole sample. So as I used a uniformly distributed sample, this probability density function is a horizontal straight line, but the particles belonging to the force chains are not completely uniformly distributed over the range of accessible radii, and mostly big particles tends to be more easily involved in force chains. And what is interesting is the reason why I plot this curve with error bars is that this probability density function is stable along the loading, the triaxial loading. And actually it results from the population of force chains evolves, but statistically the distribution of radius stays the same. If you look at quantitatively at the number of particles involved in these force chains, you see that you range between 24 to 28%, and at first you increase the number of particles involved, and then it decreases and then stabilizes. If you look at the mean length of a force chain in terms of particles, then you follow this increase. You have an increasing length of chain particles, and then you stabilize, very consistent with the mechanical loading. In the upper graph, you can see that the peak for the number of chain particles involved is a little before the actual peak stress, and this is due to the fact that you are from this point to this point, you are actually loading more the chain particles, but not recruiting new ones. This can be explained if you look at the evolution of the population of chain particles. If you have at first a given set of particles, then this set evolves, and in the actual set you have particles that were not initially identified as chain particles, and particles that were initially identified as chain particles that are not existing anymore in the actual configuration. And so you have these three different population of particles. Some particles very stable in force chains that actually represent only half of the initial set. particles that died and particles that born. And on this graph you see the evolution of the number of born particles in solid line. So this number increased rapidly at first and stabilized, and the number of particles that died. And actually the dying number of particles increased slower, and which explains the slight delay between the maximum number of particles involved in force chains and the position of the peak. So at first, when you load, you recruit rapidly new particles, and you destroy chains less rapidly than you recruit some new particles. And from the point that you destroy more chains than you are able to build new chain, then you reach a maximum stress in the deviatoric stress response, and then you start to enter in the softening regime as the number of dyed particles goes above the number of born particles. So just for the sake of illustration, this is just a video showing you the evolution of the population of the chain particles across the triaxial test. So this is just to show you visually the same results as illustrated by the curve, that you have a number of stable particles that doesn't move, and some glittering particles that are recruited or destroyed from the force chains. So now I want to go to the definition of a mesoscale associated with these force chains. And this could be useful in terms of homogenization, because it could provide an intermediate scale between the grain scale and the continuum scale, at which contains the physics of and the micromechanics behavior of granular material, and that can be used to set up the dimension of the REV. You can use a numerical homogenization process as a multiple of the dimension of this mesostructure. And so in order to define this mesoscopic scale, I use what is called the two-point autocorrelation function, and the integral range theory that was developed by Matron or Canit and other. And this is based on this on the joint probability that a given material point x, not material point, a given geometrical point x, and it's translated by a vector h, which is the parameter of this function, simultaneously belongs to the chain particles. So if these 2 points are simultaneously inside grain, the result is 1. If one of these 2 points is outside, the result of the evaluation is 0. And so you can define a joint probability like this. And if the vector h is equal to 0, then you get the compacity of your medium. And if this vector h is going to infinity, if we assume that we have finite correlation in our model because of probability independence, then you should recover the compacity to the square. So then you can normalize this function in this form by subtracting the initial value and dividing by the final value. So this gives you a function that goes from 1 to 0, and the speed at which it goes from 1 to 0 gives you the correlation length of your sample. So if the result is 1, you have correlation. The result is 0, you have no correlation. And then, because you do the computation on finite length, and if you need then to integrate this function, and if you have a slight error that you integrate along infinity, it will give you very big error in your model. So I use this kind of fit, which is an exponential fit, which doesn't have a strong physical meaning, but it's at least respecting the initial final value of the autocorrelation function, and also the fact that the tangent at the point h equal to 0 is not null, and it is equal to the specific surface of the material. So in this fit, you introduce 3 length scale parameters, Lx prime, Ly prime, and Lz prime, that gives you 3 autocorrelation in the 3 space direction, which are aligned with the anisotropy of the external load, and also and you can plot the evaluation of this autocorrelation function for along this the many direction of the vector h. But if it is sufficient to restrict the analysis along the direction x, y, and z, which are the 3 this direction of principal direction of the stress, the macroscopic stress, in our numerical simulation. At first, if you see that all the 3 autocorrelation functions are merged in a single curve, and you can evaluate the length scale parameters at first, and as soon as you start applying a deviatoric stress, then you have the autocorrelation in the horizontal direction, which is the dashed black line, which decreases faster than the one in the z direction, which is the direction of the deviatoric stress and also the direction of the growth of the force chains. And if you plot the evolution of these 3 length scale parameters with respect to the level of axial strain, then you see that the horizontal parameters, they remain mostly constant with a very low, small distance of autocorrelation. So this means that your structure is not very well correlated in the horizontal direction. And on the contrary, with respect to the vertical displacement, then you have an increase in this vertical correlation, which is to be linked with the shape of the deviatoric curve that I showed you at the beginning. And so this also provides like a typical scale associated with this mesovolume of force chains with a typical distance of 3.8 times the mean radius in the vertical direction and 2.5 in the 2.6 in the horizontal direction. So if we reconsider our initial sample with respect to this length scale, we have a sample that is approximately 30 times bigger in every direction than this typical length scale, and so a posteriori we can say that our sample was sufficient to represent a representative elementary volume of our sample and justify a priori the approach I've been carried out. So that was what I was showing you, is that this correlates very well with the stress, the deviatoric stress response of the material. So force chains are a good tool to explain from a micromechanical point of view the macroscopic response of the soil. And just for the sake of illustration, this is the results of the, if you compute the autocorrelation of your sample without restricting the analysis to the chain particles. This is the results you obtain if you compute the autocorrelation function for all particles. And you see that there, even if you have a bigger correlation in the z direction, you don't recover, you don't catch this peak-like curve you obtain for the mechanical response. So, as a result, we can say that the chain particles is the primary fabric of your granular material and is the microstructure you should consider to have information about the mechanical response of the overall sample. So if you go from the REV scale to the grain scale, then we introduce a mesoscale based on the force chain concept, which is a mesostructure that is able to account for the mechanical behavior of granular materials. The chain growth means strengthening of the material. The dying of chain particles and short life chains means softening, and the interplay between the ability of particles to go from the chain particles to non-chain and reversed from the chain to the chain particles. This exchange between these two phases in the granular materials explains whether you have a stable or unstable material. If you have the same amount of particles that goes from one phase to the other, then you have a material that is able to adapt to the evolution of the strain of the external loading you're applying to. And if you have more dying particles than Bohr particles, then you get the initiation of instability. And this is something you can easily test in the numeric. Is, for instance, if you remove the free particles from your materials, so particles that are not in contact with any other particles, and then if you just, this doesn't change the mechanical behavior incrementally, but if you just slightly change the mechanical behavior, the external loading, sorry, then you have a sudden collapse of your material because of this process that chain particles become non-chain, but there is no non-chain particles able to become chain particles. And the spatial autocorrelation function provides a quantitative definition of the size of the mesoscale for homogenization purpose. So, thank you for your attention, and I remain at your disposal for any questions.
Questions? Maybe, probably you told that I missed. What is the ratio between the overall length of your sample and the maximum length of your chain force chains?
It is approximately 30. The sample is approximately 30.
So this depends on the sample. If you double the sample, the maximum length of force chains double?
No. No, at a certain point it becomes stable. I mean, it becomes independent from the size of the temple.
You did, it was about 30.
30.
And it becomes stable if you increase.
If you increase further.
It depends on the elasticity, dimension of the grain. Depends on the geometrical and mechanical properties of the grains, this maximal length.
I didn't explore widely this, but I guess at a certain point. At least, for instance, you have between your grains, here you have, if you have a more Coulomb type criterion, that if the shear stress, the shear force becomes too large, then you get sliding between the grains. So if you decrease the friction angle between particles, then you will narrow the range of admissible deviation for the force chain. So this will have an effect on the chain particle. Yes.
I propose the same question, but in terms of size of the sample, but in terms of the size of the grains. What is the chain? It's about how many grains?
The chains. This is the average length here. It ranges from 4 to 5.
4 to 5.
4 to 5 grains approximately in terms of length.
Laterally, it's about
And yeah, the correlation laterally is about 2.5. It means that you have approximately a grain, a void, and then a grain. So this is like the domain of influence of a chain.
Can you, from the model, say in advance when you change from the regime when the change are balanced, or when you change after more balanced?
This is a good question. I don't have the answer yet. I am able to explain the macroscopic behavior from the microscopic arrangement of chain particles, but I'm not able to tell you whether a given microstructure is able to build new chains or not. Sorry. Yes.
I just want to ask about your criteria to define strong force chain and weak force chain. Because you have three criteria.
Yeah, there is three and
Another criteria was used quite commonly in history is force magnitude larger than it's like you have average force. It's higher than average contact force. It's defined as strong force chain. It's smaller than 1. It's defined as weak force chain. So I just wonder, these two criteria, are they more or less the same, or actually the result completely depends on your criteria?
The two approaches are, there is one way of thinking is to look at the contact force, and this is centered on the contacts. The approach I use is more centered on the particles. Actually.
Behind your criteria, but because in the literature there are these two different criteria, I just trying to understand, are they divide strong force chain and weak force chain in a similar way, or actually can be very different?
I didn't check that, but I guess my feeling is that the way of defining force chains with contacts and not particles is you propagate actually more, I think, the effect of the boundary. But it's not, I didn't check actually. Yeah. The thing I wanted to show you is that yeah, you say that there was three parameters that you use, three result value that you use when you define force chains, and I performed the sensitivity analysis on these parameters, and what is quite clear is here, if you look at this stress ratio, if you say I should be bigger than the average mean principal stress, or I should be bigger than twice this mean principal stress, and it seems that you have a transition from a high number of particles identified in the force chains to a low number of particles identified in the force chains around the value of 1. So this seems to be physically motivated to take this value of 1 for the stress ratio. This is a little less clear concerning the angle that you admit for two particles to be inside the same structure, but the number of particles identified in the chain goes continuously from zero to a maximum value if you increase this angle. So if you let the chains, so I took the value in the middle. And for the number of consecutive particles, this is also you decay a little bit. So I take the lower limit that you can consider as a structure is at the value of 3.
Okay. So I think many of the questions have already been asked. I think you're asking my question, but I wanted to know what kind of sensitivity analysis have you attempted? For example, if you change the local law, I suppose right now you have springs.
Yes.
Dashboard. There is some dissipation other than the frictional dissipation.
There is in this I have only the friction dissipation.
So there is no rate dependency. Of course, the elasticity will change. What other parameters will affect the correlation? That's one thing, and I have a corollary to it, is if you have attempted to look at the correlation between the particle movement rather than force change.
So far, I didn't explore many other contact laws. Actually, in the way of defining the chain particles, you have to be able to define the mean stress inside the grain. So this limits the number, the load type, the contact load type you can use with this kind of model. If you have only contact forces, it's okay. If you use, for instance, low with rolling resistance, or so, it's less easy. And so I don't have any idea for the dependence on the contact law. As I started saying, the friction angle should have a very strong influence, but I didn't. And also the particle shapes should be important too. Your second question was?
Look for correlation in terms of...
Yeah, correlation in terms of displacement.
So I have a paper about this maybe in end of 1990s.
Yeah, okay.